If you clicked on this video, I'm assuming that you've been struggling with this problem for a while. I struggled to memorize the notes on the fretboard for years, and most guitarists do. Frankly, it got to the point where I was embarrassed about not knowing this information, so I designed a system to finally, deeply, and truly memorize the fretboard once and for all. It took me 34 days, and I memorized all of the notes on the fretboard and all of the major and minor triads that go with them. So in this video, I'm going to show you how I did it, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the learning methodologies behind why I designed this system the way that I did. But first, we have to get something out of the way. I keep seeing these videos all over the internet about how to memorize the fretboard in 15 minutes or 5 minutes or 3 minutes. I even have a book titled How to Memorize the Fretboard in Less Than 24 Hours. On some level, we all know that that's just not how it works. But are these people actively lying to us? Not exactly. Here's the problem. There are two different levels to knowing things. Level one, I'm calling test time knowledge. This means if I gave you the question on a test, you would be able to figure out the answer to it in a reasonable amount of time. As an example, if you saw this math problem on a test, I'm assuming all of you would get it right. But it takes a little bit of time because we don't actually know the answer to the question. We know a process for getting to the answer. We don't know it the same way we know what 2 + 2 is. We know that one immediately. And this is level 2. This is real-time knowledge or immediate recall. If I was holding an egg and I threw it to you and I said, "What's 2 + 2?" you would be able to answer the question and catch the egg at the same time. And that is the level of knowledge we want for the fretboard. We want to be able to be in a live musical setting where we're listening to multiple different instruments at once, where we're thinking about what chords are coming up next, and the beats are just flying by, and we want to still be able to utilize this information on our instrument. The problem with all of these other videos and these books is that they're teaching a path to level 1 knowledge. They're teaching a process to figure out the names of the notes on the fretboard. Maybe it's a sentence with funny animals so you don't forget it. Maybe it's replicating octave patterns across the fretboard. Maybe it's a little pattern that outlines the alphabet. Whatever it is, it's a process to figure out the names of the notes. And if someone gave you a diagram of the fretboard on a test and you had to fill out the names, these systems would work great. But that's not what we want. We want level 2 knowledge. We want immediate recall. So how do we do it? Now that we know what we actually want, I'm sure you already have a better idea of how to get there. We've all memorized things before. We all know that it takes time and it takes repetition. But luckily, there is a stack of proven learning methodologies that we can use to get there much quicker than we would by just haphazardly applying brute force repetition with no structure and no plan. Now, I don't have time in this video to deeply explain all of these learning methodologies. If you want to know more about them and you want to have access to all of the flashcards that I built for this system and have a video that walks you through each day of the process, I turned this whole system into a video course and you can check it out. There's a link in the description. But for a very brief run through, here we go. In order to put information into long-term memory, it first has to be held in working memory. And working memory only holds about 7 pieces of information at a time, so we have to take this huge problem of memorizing all the notes on the fretboard and break it down into these bite-sized chunks that'll fit into working memory. There are only 7 named notes in 1 octave on 1 string of the guitar. So for the first 6 days, those were my sets. I did 1 string per day and I made flashcards for each note. If you add too much information in one day, the earlier information just gets pushed out of working memory and then it never gets passed on to long term. This is why cramming for a test never produces lifelong knowledge. Each day after doing the new string, I would review the flashcards from the previous day just to keep the information fresh in my mind and make sure it wasn't too long between repetitions. Which brings us to step 2. spaced repetition. Once we have our bite-sized chunks, we need to repeat them at optimal intervals over time in order to strengthen the memories as quickly as possible. And this is called spaced repetition. Scientists have done a bunch of research as to what the optimal intervals are, but luckily there's a free advanced flashcard application called Anki that keeps track of all of the timing for us and does the spaced repetition thing without us having to think about it, so that's what I used. One of the key points here is that our brain builds new neurons and wraps them in myelin, the stuff that makes the neural connections faster. It does all of this while we sleep. So there's only so much memorization you can do in one day. You actually have to forget what you learned a little bit and then relearn it again to strengthen the memory. It's sort of like how you need to break a muscle down before you can rebuild it and make it stronger. Once we get all of these chunks of information into our memory, we need to be able to access it when we want it, which brings us to step 3, recall training. We all have far more information in our head at any given time than we have access to in that moment. The recall pathway is a separate pathway from the memory itself. So if you don't have a well-trained recall pathway, the memory itself can be virtually useless. For the names of the notes on the fretboard, there are 2 obvious recall pathways. One of them is going from the name to the note, so where is a C on the low E string? The other one is going from the note to the name, so what is this note? The way that I trained for number 1 was by using this cool free website called Flashchord that just generates a random stream of chords playing along to a metronome. It shows you which one's coming up next. So in the beginning, I would just set this to the key of C and put only major chords. So it would just give me a random generation of different notes. And then I would pick one string and I would practice just the notes on that one string, recalling them as they randomly came up. The way that I trained for number 2 was with the flashcard app Anki that I mentioned earlier, making diagrams of the fretboard that showed a note or a triad, and then the answer would be the name of the note or the chord or whatever it is. So once we get all of this information into our heads and then we have good ways to train our recall pathways, then we need to stabilize these memories as much as possible by connecting them to as many other memories as we can. Which brings us to step 4, contextual learning. The basis of contextual learning is that the more different connections a memory has to other memories, the more stable that memory is and the easier it is to recall. So I knew that I needed to connect all the notes on the fretboard to a bunch of other things to make them stable, and I wanted those connections to be as useful as possible. So what I chose to do was some octave patterns, a few of the most common bar chord shapes, and then all of the major and minor triads. There's 12 of each, so that took 24 days in total to go through all of the triads. Altogether, this built a really nice interconnected network that connected all the memories together and built this web of knowledge that was actually very useful. Now, I know it sounds like a lot, but honestly, I only spent about 10 minutes a day on this for 34 days, and my progress was so astronomical that I couldn't believe I didn't figure this out 10 years ago. Good luck with it. I hope this helped. If you want to go through this process with me and you want to do it exactly the same way that I did it, you can check out the course in the description. I hope to see you there.